a meal that reignited a lost identity. At first, it was meant to be a farewell. One final meal prepared the old way, before the recipe vanished into memory. No one expected it to awaken something a nation believed it had already lost. But that single table would soon remind an entire culture of who it once was, and who it still might be. For years, this country had been drifting. Traditions were preserved in museums, spoken about in past tense, referenced but rarely practiced. Food, once a living expression of identity, had been polished into something exportable and safe. Familiar flavors remained, but their meaning had thinned, disconnected from the stories that gave them weight. The meal was prepared by a cook most people overlooked. He had spent his life working in quiet kitchens, never seeking recognition. His knowledge came not from schools, but from elders whose voices were fading. He remembered techniques no longer taught, gestures no longer needed, rhythms the modern world had outpaced. And now, with no apprentice to inherit them, he decided to cook the meal one last time. To understand why this moment mattered, we must return to what had been lost. Generations earlier, this meal marked transitions, births, returns, reconciliations. It was not ordered casually. It was shared deliberately. Over time, convenience replaced ceremony, speed replaced patience, and the meal slowly disappeared until it lived only in fragments of memory. On that final night, a small group gathered around the table. Not critics, not officials, just people connected by curiosity and quiet respect. The cook worked slowly, without explanation, letting the room settle into a rare stillness. When the food was served, something unexpected happened. No one spoke. The first bites carried weight. Not nostalgia, but recognition. A sensation deeper than taste, stirring something unspoken. For some, it felt like grief. For others, relief. The meal did not remind them of the past. It reminded them of themselves. And in that moment, a lost identity began to stir, ready to be reignited in ways no one had anticipated. The silence at the table lingered long after the plates were cleared. No one rushed to speak, as if words might fracture something fragile that had just surfaced. The cook watched their faces carefully, not with pride, but with a quiet unease. He had not intended to awaken anything. He had only wanted to say goodbye. But the guests carried the meal with them when they left. In the days that followed, something subtle began to ripple outward. Conversations started at home, at work, in small gatherings. People spoke about a feeling they couldn't quite name. They described the meal not as delicious, but as familiar in a way they had never experienced before. It wasn't about flavor memory. It was about belonging. Word spread quietly at first. No headlines, no trends, just invitations whispered from one person to another. More people asked the cook if he would prepare the meal again. He refused at first. The dish, he insisted, was not meant to be revived casually. It required context, intention, and time, things the modern world rarely offered. But the requests kept coming. Young people arrived with questions they had never been taught to ask. Elders arrived carrying fragmented stories they thought no one wanted to hear anymore. Families who had drifted apart found themselves sitting together again, drawn by the promise of something real. The cook felt torn. Each request honored the meal, but also risked turning it into spectacle. As the gatherings grew, attention followed. Writers asked to document the experience. Cultural institutions expressed interest. Officials spoke of preservation and national pride. They saw the meal as an opportunity, a symbol that could be packaged, promoted, and proudly displayed. The cook felt a familiar weight pressing in. He had watched this pattern before. Traditions revived, then reshaped until they no longer belonged to the people who lived them, meaning diluted into representation. Ritual flattened into performance. The very identity the meal had reignited now stood at risk of being claimed by forces that had let it fade in the first place. And yet, refusing felt impossible, because the meal was no longer his alone. It had touched something deeper, something collective. People weren't asking for a dish. They were asking for permission to reconnect with a part of themselves that had been quietly waiting. The cook stood at the center of a growing tension. Protect the meal by keeping it rare, or share it and risk losing what made it powerful. As more eyes turned toward his small kitchen, he realized the next choice would decide whether this reignited identity would remain lived and personal or be transformed into something distant and symbolic once again. The conflict had begun to surface, and it would demand more than memory to resolve it. The pressure arrived disguised as admiration. Cultural leaders praised the cook's authenticity. Academics asked to record his methods. Media outlets requested interviews framed as celebration. They spoke of revival, of heritage reclaimed, of a nation rediscovering itself through a single forgotten meal. But beneath the praise ran a current of urgency, an insistence that the moment be captured, formalized, and shared before it slipped away. The cook felt the shift immediately. What had begun as intimate gatherings now felt observed. Guests arrived with expectations shaped by stories they had heard rather than feelings they were ready to experience. Some brought cameras, others brought opinions. The room grew louder. The stillness that once defined the meal began to fracture under the weight of anticipation. The cook noticed that people spoke sooner now, faster, as if afraid silence might disappoint them. Institutions moved quickly. Proposals appeared outlining official preservation. The meal could be standardized, documented, taught. It could be served at national events, replicated across regions, transformed into a symbol of unity. They promised respect. They promised protection. They promised that nothing essential would be lost. But the cook saw what they did not. The meal was not powerful because of its ingredients or its history. It was powerful because of how it was shared, because it required patience, because it asked people to sit together without performance, without conclusion. Standardizing it would not preserve its identity. It would replace it. The conflict came to a head during one gathering meant to honor the meal's revival. Officials attended. Writers observed. The cook prepared everything perfectly, yet something felt wrong. Guests tasted politely. Applause followed. Conversation filled the room almost immediately. The silence, the one that once carried recognition, never arrived. That night, after everyone left, the cook sat alone at the table. He understood now that the identity of the meal had reignited was fragile. It could not survive applause. It could not survive being explained faster than it was felt. And it certainly could not survive being turned into proof of something for others to claim. The next day, he made a decision that confused nearly everyone. He announced that the meal would no longer be served publicly. No events, no recordings, no official preservation. The reaction was swift. Disappointment, anger, accusations of selfishness. Some claimed he was denying the nation its heritage. Others said he had let fear override responsibility. The cook listened quietly, knowing none of them were entirely wrong and none entirely right. But he also knew this. If identity was to live again, it had to be lived, not displayed, not scheduled, not owned. The story had reached its most fragile point. What followed would determine whether the meal remained a living bridge to the past or became another artifact admired from a distance. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The announcement stunned everyone. What began as a revival now looked like a retreat. Journalists framed it as a loss. Officials warned that without formal preservation, the meal would vanish again. Social voices accused the cook of hoarding something that belonged to everyone. The pressure was loud, relentless, and deeply emotional. But the cook did not retreat into silence. Instead, he changed how the meal lived. He stopped serving it in gatherings and began passing it quietly, one table at a time. He invited small groups into his kitchen, not to watch, but to learn. Not the recipe, but the responsibility. He taught them when not to cook it, why it mattered who sat at the table, why timing was as important as flavor. He explained that the meal was never meant to unite everyone at once. It was meant to reconnect people who had drifted apart. Those who learned carried it home. They cooked it for family reunions, for reconciliations, for moments that required honesty more than celebration. The meal reappeared not in public halls, but in private homes, not as a symbol, but as an act. It stopped belonging to one cook and started living where identity always had, in shared, imperfect moments. Over time, something extraordinary happened. The meal returned to the culture without needing permission. No institution owned it. No version was declared official. Variations emerged, shaped by region, memory, and necessity. Elders smiled when they tasted it again, not because it was correct, but because it was alive. Young people learned its meaning without needing to name it. The nation never announced its return. It simply felt it. Years later, when asked why he had refused recognition, the cook answered with gentle clarity, because identity does not survive by being preserved. It survives by being practiced, repeated, allowed to change without losing at heart. The meal was never lost again. It moved quietly through kitchens and homes, passed hand to hand, moment to moment, not loud enough to be claimed, not fragile enough to disappear. And in that quiet persistence, a culture remembered itself, not through nostalgia, but through living connection. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future, a